Good morning. Today I just want to talk a little bit about the second book, When Liberty is Stressed. I realize in a computer camera it's flipped backwards. The book, it was the first book when a gay conservative lashes back that I pitched at the Pitch Fest in Los Angeles. This is the second one, which is a set of essays. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the report I got back from iUniverse on the bookstore engagement campaign, or the bookstore marketing campaign, and it seems like it did pretty well. They report that they're on the second phase of it. There was more response to it than from a usual bookstore marketing campaign that they've done in the past. Even though the book is 20 years old, I think that the main reason that there's interest is Alito, and the Supreme Court and the leak of the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which I do not talk about very much directly in the books. I barely mention it in the first book. But the fact that other individual rights might have to go back and be renegotiated is kind of in play. Back in 1998, 1999, when my first book was rolling around, and after I'd moved to Minneapolis, we were talking a lot about a Bill of Rights too. And in the second book, there are 10 essays, some which deal with various aspects of individual rights for the most part. But one of them is what it would take to rewrite the Bill of Rights and pass a constitutional amendment, or could you do it through laws, like was recently done with gay marriage by Congress? Could you reaffirm some of these individual rights one at a time? It's only fair for me to say that in the book I did not specifically mention the Second Amendment, which is rather strange that I would leave it out. And I wanted to note that recently online there's been a kind of a battle on Twitter with David Hogg saying you have no right to own a gun. It has to do with the militia phrase in the Second Amendment. However, and he hasn't answered this. We have an opinion, District of Columbia versus Heller, that's in Wikipedia, written up in Wikipedia from 2008, in which an appeals court and then the Supreme Court itself said that the militia clause was sort of prefatory, and that on the frontier even people understood you needed to be able to defend yourself sometimes against enemies, against other things like wild animals and so forth. So it was perfectly understood to be an individual right. So I just think it's kind of interesting that no one has mentioned DC versus Heller on Twitter that I can see in response to David's tweet. And it's right out there in plain sight, and I don't know what their answer is. I do agree that there is something wrong with what's going on. There are way too many guns, there are way too many assault weapons. But I'm not going to get into that too much right here. A couple of other things in the first book. It was written long before gay marriage was legal. In fact, it wasn't until 2004 that a state in Massachusetts recognized it, and the first book was written in 1997. So I had actually proposed that there be some allowance for it, but was much milder than what finally happened. So in a sense, the two books are obsolete on that issue because they were written long before gay marriage was passed. Also, the first book, or the second book, there are essays about how to respond to terrorism, because the book was written shortly after 9/11. And in fact, there is a provision, this discussion of gays in the military again, because Don't Ask, Don't Tell hadn't been repealed yet. and that Charles Moscos had even gone back on his privacy in the barracks argument and argued that we needed a draft. There's an essay on the military draft in that book. It's of interest today that transgender people still have to register for selective service according to sex assigned at birth. Not many people seem to know that. There are essays on gay rights, as it was at the time, and on other issues like the polarity theory of Paul Rosenfels that was at the 9th Street Center back in the 1970s, and it continued until the early 1990s. The idea that one has his birth gender, or birth sex, not gender, birth sex, but can express a polarity that's masculine or feminine, and other ideas like being objective or subjective. And you just simply keep your physical presence as it is, and you live your life the way you want to according to your polarity, which seems a lot more progressive than what's going on today with gender theory. So it's a good answer to gender theory. There's also a discussion about the way the workplace was kind of falling apart, which is one reason why Obamacare didn't have a very good technical implementation, because the people weren't around with the maturity to put the system in right, and at least if you ask me. And there's a discussion of the ethics of self-publishing that we're going to get into in another video soon. Back in October when I was in Williamsburg, I made 3 videos on that book on October 10th. So if you go back into my YouTube account, you can find them. I would also say that one other thing. Even though I have gotten a royalty check from iUniverse recently, and it does seem like the second book has sold a lot more recently than it had been before, and Alito might be one of the reasons. And also the Bookstore campaign seems to be working. Back in the Pitch Fest in Los Angeles, they did say that they admitted that with self-published books, many of them don't sell real well, but are still appealing ideas for content. Maybe not as much for big feature films where people do remakes all the time, and there are these established franchises that are really big money makers, the Marvel franchises, for example. But for smaller films, for Netflix, for Hulu, for several other streaming channels, for large YouTube entries and so forth, there is a sort of a secondary market for streaming content, a sort of intermediate between Hollywood and YouTube, the more less professional kinds of YouTube like I'm able to do. So that's what I've got for today.